Union of Psychological Science and Professor of Psychology at the University of Ottawa. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session on behalf of the International Union of Psychological Science, which is the sponsor and convener of this session. The second thing I want to do is thank everyone who is here for having had the discipline to come back indoors from that absolutely magnificent sunny Bergen day, which I gather is the kind of rare day in Bergen that people really like to be outdoors on. So thank you for being here. We have a really excellent symposium lined up for you this morning. 3 distinguished colleagues with expertise in the substantive area that we're going to be addressing. Just to be sure that everybody is where they thought they would be, as is noted on the screen, this session is addressed to the theme, One World or Many, Are Values Converging or Diverging? And I will introduce each speaker as they present rather than do an overview of all the speakers at once. Let me give you a brief sense of the format of the session so you have an idea of how it has been structured and where your role will be within it. Initially, we will hear from each of the speakers, and they will present their substantive presentations. Following that, we will then open it up to the interactive part. I've asked the speakers to speak within the time frame of 20 maximum, absolute maximum, 25 minutes. And then when we go to the interactive stage, the first thing I'm going to do is ask the speakers if there's anything they want to say to each other by virtue of what they've heard. And that will be no more than 5 or 6 minutes, so that we then have approximately a good solid half hour to interact with you. I have a strong bias for this kind of session that if you've come, it's because you have some interest in the topic. And you too might like to participate in the exchange, either by way of questions or challenges or reaffirmations of something that you've heard. And I'll do my best to keep things on time and to provide some kind of orderly process to the interactive part of the session. So the one thing I did want you to know, though, that if you had a question to a particular speaker, particularly the first 2, I will not be going to the audience after each of their presentations. We will do all the presentations first and then go to the interactive portion. Okay. So thank you for bearing that in mind. But while you are listening, start jotting down the things that you might want to bring forward as your part of the session. We're going to go right at this point to Professor Shalom Schwartz, who is our lead-off speaker. In addition to the bio that you have, I think we have some information on everybody up there, do we not? Yes, we do. So you already know that he's an emeritus professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and adjunct professor here at the University of Bergen. He's also been heavily involved in cross-cultural issues, and he's a past president of the International Association for Cross-Cultural Psychology and a fellow of the American Psychological Association. He's organized and directs a project that has studied basic values now in 77 countries. And the European Social Survey, of which he's on the Scientific Advisory Board, includes a survey that he designed. His publications on values have appeared in a huge number of publications and outlets spanning social psychology, cross-cultural psychology, political psychology, sociology, education, law, and economics. And he is the recipient of Israel's most prestigious civilian prize for his career research in psychology. Please welcome Professor Schwartz.
Thank you, Pierre, for, wow, powerful. Okay, thank you, Pierre, for that fine introduction. I'll try to live up to it. Where is it? Okay. Just let me give you a quick overview of the things I will try to cover today fairly rapidly. I'm going to start by presenting 3 dimensions of culture on which I will be doing various comparisons and discussing various differences across countries. I won't present detailed theory or empirical evidence for them, but I assure you that there are both, and that's not what we're talking about today, so I'll ask you to take that for granted. I'll then show you how the world maps out 77 countries using these 3 dimensions. I'll give you a hint or two about how those dimensions work and therefore why I think they're useful. And one of the things we'll discover is that using these dimensions, we identify essentially 8 regions of culture around the world. And so I will want to take a look at how important, how differentiated are the regions of culture around the world, and how well do they explain differences in culture in countries as compared to, let's say, religion, which is a very important discriminating factor, and you'll hear more about later. Then also, I will try to address the question very briefly of to what extent these cultural differences among nations, to what extent are nations culturally different as compared with the variation within nations. Generally speaking, when we use psychological variables, the variance within countries is much larger than the variance between countries. To what extent is that the case here? How does differences among country and culture compare with differences, let's say, among age groups within culture or among gender groups within culture? Then I will turn to the question of how stable are these national cultural differences over time, and finally say a few words about is there evidence that there is convergence across countries and cultures or not. So I begin with the dimensions. Now, I'll be talking about 3 dimensions which we derive by looking at 3 different questions. The first question is, what is the ideal relationship between the individual person and the larger group of which the person is a part? And I suggest that every culture has to somehow or other come up with a way of dealing with this question. And we can talk about 2 extreme ways. One is a cultural emphasis on what I call embeddedness, cultures in which values like order and obedience are particularly important. And embeddedness cultures are cultures where the primary group is the important unit. That's the meaningful unit. The individual is embedded in the group. The individual is expected to find meaning through identifying with the group, through sharing the goals of the group, through seeking to promote the goals of the group. Of the countries I've looked at, among those highest in embeddedness, we find, for example, Yemen, which will give you a sense. An alternative way of handling the relationship between the individual and the group, the other extreme, is an emphasis on the individual, the autonomous individual, as unique and as encouraged to develop his or her, to cultivate his or her uniqueness. And in so doing, I talk about 2 different kinds of autonomy: intellectual autonomy, which emphasizes the idea that people should develop their own ideas, be creative in their own unique ways, and affective autonomy, which emphasizes the idea that people should follow their own emotions, feelings, and develop those. So at this end, for example, France is particularly high in intellectual autonomy. The samples I've studied in the United States are particularly high in affective autonomy. In fact, you might say affective autonomy explains in part or reflects what is reflected is, for example, the psychiatric or psychological emphasis on finding out who you are that we find quite uniquely in the United States and in Argentina. Okay, the second dimension I will talk about arises from the question of what is the ideal way to get people to produce, to cooperate, and thereby to maintain the fabric of society. Every society has some way or other to get people to work, to do things, and to cooperate. And here too I suggest that there are 2 alternative extreme ways that this can be done. One emphasizes the hierarchical organization of the society. Everyone has a role to play. We are born into our roles. We function in organizations. And if everyone does what he or she is supposed to as part of their functioning in this hierarchical society, things are going to get done. There won't be too much conflict. There will be the cooperation necessary to produce. So what is critical here are the role obligations. And as you see, things like authority, power, these are values which are particularly valued in hierarchical societies. Of the societies I've studied, China is a good example of one very high in hierarchy. Iran is very high in hierarchy. The opposing solution, instead of relying on roles to get us to do what we take naturally as the legitimate way to organize society, instead, the idea is to get people to internalize their obligations to others, to recognize our interdependence, and recognizing each other as equals, at least morally, as human beings, if not in terms of our resources, to recognize our interdependence as well and voluntarily to work together for the shared welfare. You can't organize a society totally this way, but this is one possible extreme opposed to hierarchy. A country particularly high in that, for example, is where we are right now, here in Norway or Spain. Both score very high. And the last of these three dimensions I will use addresses yet another country, and another question, and that is, how do we regulate the use of human and natural resources? What is the way that ought to be done? And one emphasis here is the emphasis on what I call mastery. Values like ambition and change are important parts of this, this way of handling human and natural resources. The idea here is that humankind should be progressing, should be changing, should constantly be improving, whereas the opposing position, which I call harmony, essentially says no, humankind should be fitting in. We should be seeking peaceful relations with ourselves and with nature. We should be protecting nature, not trying to change things. At the harmony end, a country high in that, for example, is Slovenia. And at the mastery end, countries high in that, for example, are Zimbabwe. But as we will see, Zimbabwe is high in mastery and in hierarchy. And on the other hand, New Zealand, which is high in mastery, but is high in autonomy. This makes a big difference because the norms calling for change, calling for progress, could be in the interests of individuals, New Zealand, together with autonomy, or in the interests of groups. China also is high, Zimbabwe is high, but here the emphasis is on groups. So we have a total picture that we can go on now of three dimensions, and behind them what I'm showing you, and I'll show you the basis for it in a moment, are the 8 regions of the world that come out when we use these 3 dimensions to map 77 different countries around the world. These 8 regions are actually pulled out by looking at the next slide, but I figured if I showed you that first, you'd get lost. This slide has 77 countries on it, and they are arranged along these 3 dimensions. Actually, they are arranged along taking each of the 7 polar aspects of the dimensions, and it is a 2-dimensional projection so that any 2 countries that are close to each other on the map are closer together culturally when you put all 3 of these dimensions together. However, it's also possible to talk about what do Portugal and Greece differ on, or what do Italy and China differ on. They don't differ necessarily on all of the dimensions, because China is moderately high on embeddedness, extremely high on hierarchy, it's way down here, extremely high on mastery, and we've disappeared, yeah. So we could compare China and say China and Thailand are quite similar on hierarchy. China and the US. The US is not quite as high on hierarchy as China, but it is about equally high on mastery. In other words, we can compare on each of these dimensions separately. But I won't go into all of the comparisons. I'll leave the map up while I take a look at what is going on here. So all the countries that are high in embeddedness are also way up here. The ones that are low in embeddedness are down here. To represent 3 dimensions or even 7 things in a 2-dimensional space means there's some error. This is obviously not perfect, but the error is not great because, in fact, the world appears to be organized in a way that fits this circular structure, so that virtually every country that is high in embeddedness, not virtually, every country that is high in embeddedness is low in both types of autonomy. Virtually every country, and here there is an exception, that is high in hierarchy is low in egalitarianism, and vice versa. So that this is not a bad representation. The exception is Japan, about which I will not speak, but they really don't fit the pattern very well at all, and we can talk about that if that interests you later. Okay, so the next question I wanted to ask was, how about the amount of variation there really is? Clearly there is variation among cultures on all 3 of these dimensions, but I pulled out regions. The regions are simply, if you look closely, you will see the regions right there in the map. I go back to them for a moment. There are these 8 regions: West Europe at one extreme, Muslim Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, which I cannot separate on this side, and so on. The English-speaking group is a group. It is a region culturally different from West Europe, and Quebec falls in West Europe, whereas English-speaking Canada falls in the English-speaking group. Now, are these regional differences really all that important, or did I just conveniently draw the pictures? So one of the questions I asked then is, how does region compare with the dominant historical religion, religion being a very important cultural factor, in terms of ability to explain variance in culture across countries? And what we find is that religion explains about 4 to 5 times, culture explains 4 to 5, cultural region explains 4 to 5 times the variance that dominant religion does in the cultural differences here. Region really is big. Region explains more variation than gross domestic product does. We know that culture is highly related on everybody's dimensions to the socioeconomic level of countries. Turns out region is even more strongly related. How about within countries? How does the cultural difference among countries compare to the cultural differences among groups within countries? I'll just talk about 2 types of groups. Gender. Does gender make a difference as compared with country, or is country a much more important factor in determining the values of people? Culture is much more determined by country differences than by age differences. We're talking about anywhere, depending on dimensions, from 20 times as much, because gender explains so little, to about 5 times as much. Or how about age differences? We're looking at samples that differ quite substantially in age. Age explains a little more than gender, but still only about 1/4 or less as much as country differences in culture. So the point I've been trying to make up until here is that country differences in culture are large. There is variance within cultures, but not as much as there is between cultures. And the world can be split into regions which differ substantially from one another in their basic values. I should make clear I'm talking about basic values. I'm not talking about more superficial things on which we might, in fact, find some more convergence than we will see. To look at this in a slightly different way, I won't go through this whole table in detail. I just wanted to say a few words to give you a feel for how these cultural dimensions work. So here are some associations of country differences in culture on the three dimensions with a variety of other characteristics of countries. For example, how much ethnic homogeneity is there? What this shows is that there is substantially more ethnic homogeneity in autonomous versus high embeddedness cultures, and in cultures high in harmony, low in mastery. Or how about the size of families? And here we can show how culture over time, in fact, influences, probably influences, I should say, using path analyses, the size of the families. So in high autonomy cultures, smaller families. High embeddedness cultures, larger families. And over time, the higher the embeddedness, the larger the families get, the higher the autonomy, the smaller the families have been getting. To take another example, military intervention. When countries have been faced with crises, do they use military reactions in order to deal with these crises? Here we find that high mastery countries use the military approach much more than high harmony countries. You can see a few other things there. I'll just give one more example, and that is the competitiveness of the capitalism. Here's the only one where I did not have to control for GDP, although I did anyway, because there is no relationship between the competitiveness of capitalism across these 20 countries and their socioeconomic level. But what we find is the more emphasis on mastery, the higher the competitiveness in the capitalist system. The more emphasis on harmony, the lower. Okay, this gives you a sense of how these dimensions work. We can now go on and look at the question of change first in the cultural value dimensions over time. These data that I will show you now are based on 39 sample pairs across 25 different countries. The data are from a limited period, and you have to keep that in mind. We're only looking at an average period of about 7.5 years. And the samples are matched. So it's an average of 7.5 years, but it is not the same sample. Most were between 88 and 2000. And that's important because that was a period in many of these countries of major shift. For example, China is among these countries, Hong Kong, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Estonia. These are countries which were undergoing major social change during this period. And considering that and the imprecision of the match, these are correlations of across those 25 countries. Now you have to keep in mind, correlations don't mean that there wasn't change. They simply mean that the order of the countries remained quite the same. Not 100% the same, but 80% of the variance at least is the same. And if you allow for a little error, that suggests very high stability, at least across this 7.5-year period, even though many of these countries were undergoing substantial change. So one kind of change would be change in the order of the countries, which we see here was not very much. Another kind of change might simply be a secular change in the world where everyone is moving in the same direction. So we'll look at that in a moment. And finally, the kind of change about convergence would refer to is the variability among the countries increasing or decreasing. I'll look at that as well. So first we see that the order of countries has changed very little. Now let's look at these same data at the importance levels. Have they changed? Egalitarianism hierarchy. In almost every country, egalitarianism that we've studied, not everyone, but almost everyone, 32 out of the 39 samples we looked at, egalitarianism was more important than hierarchy, so that's why that's quite high. But as you can see, that line across time for importance is virtually at the same level. The bars going up and down are one standard deviation of the variance across countries. And as you can see, that too has remained virtually stable for egalitarianism and hierarchy. Nothing really changed very much. There was a slight increase in hierarchy in Eastern Europe during this time. This is the period when communism was thrown off, and yet we see a very small increase in hierarchy. But when you put them all together, there is virtually no change, and there is no convergence or divergence. Right? The variability remains the same. If we look next at autonomy embeddedness, here in most countries autonomy is more important, but again, we see that the average importance across countries of autonomy from time 1 to time 2 is virtually unchanged. There has been, I won't go further than that. No country changed a great deal in this. We're talking about changes of certainly less than 1/5 of a standard deviation at the very most, 1/6 at the very most. If, however, we look at harmony mastery, we begin to see a little bit, and as far as the variation is concerned on autonomy and embeddedness, is there convergence or divergence? Neither. Stays essentially the same. When we move on to harmony mastery, however, we see that's low. It's very close to 0 because countries are such that there is a balance between the two, so that when you subtract one from the other, we come out to about 0, slight tendency toward greater harmony. And here we do find the country order we saw was stable, but now there is some significant movement down, meaning mastery was becoming more important. Change, progress versus fitting in, keeping things the way they are, worrying about peace. That went down. Mastery went up slightly during this period. It's about a 1/4 of a standard deviation change across countries with greater importance for mastery. And this occurred primarily in Eastern Europe and in Latin America, whereas in Western Europe, we saw, in fact, an increase of a lesser degree. But all across the map, there seemed to be some increase in mastery. On the other hand, if we look at the variance, no convergence, no divergence, there is essentially parallel change, small change, but then only 7.5 years. Now I want to ask the same questions with a different set of data. Excuse me. These data come from the European Social Survey, and they are data on 17 countries only, but these are very nice data because they are from representative national samples, and they are over a period of only a couple of years. So these are 17 countries, well-matched samples, but not panel data. the countries are listed there, and we're only talking about a 4-year period. If you look at the degree of order changing or remaining the same, not surprisingly, after what we'd seen before, it remains quite the same here. Although something seems to have happened with Spain, because we can jump from 0.83 to 0.89 just by pulling out one country. Spain has undergone some real change there, whereas the other countries seem quite stable. So once again, we see that the order of countries has changed very little. But has there been convergence or divergence in this European set of countries? And has there been a change in importance? That's what we look at with this last of my data slides. First, looking again at egalitarianism hierarchy. Egalitarianism is higher generally than hierarchy. And if we look at it, the measurement, by the way, this is a totally different instrument that's being used to measure the same constructs. So you can't compare across the two sets that I just mentioned. What we find is that autonomy seems to be, starting with egalitarianism hierarchy, we see stability in the average importance, once again, almost no change whatsoever. None of the countries showed any substantial change during this period, and the variance shows no change, which says, okay, no convergence and essentially no change. But we're talking about 4 years. It's hard to know. If we look at, I'm sorry, there is a slight increase in the variance. If you look closely at egalitarianism hierarchy, a slight increase primarily between 202, 204, and then staying about the same to 206. So what we have is, if anything, a little bit of divergence, but certainly no convergence. If you look at autonomy embeddedness down here, and it's then we see that the average importance is stable and that the variance is essentially unchanged. Finally, if we look at harmony mastery, we see that the average importance is stable again. What had happened in Spain, however, is that in Spain, harmony had become a good deal more important than mastery during this period. That accounts for the change. It's about a third of a standard deviation, which is quite striking. And the variance increased from 2002 to 2004 and increased a bit more to 2006. In other words, a little bit of evidence for divergence in harmony mastery. So if I were to sum up, I've shown you 3 cultural value dimensions that can be usefully used to distinguish among societies. I've shown you that when we map countries using these dimensions, they seem to form cultural regions, and that these region differences are very substantial. They are more substantial than if you were trying to explain things with religion alone. They are more substantial than if you were trying to explain things, differences in cultures, with socioeconomic level. Region differences are big. I've also tried to show that individual values differ more as a function of country. The variance within countries is better, the variance at the individual level is better explained by country than it is by at least 2 important characteristics of individuals, their age and their gender. And I've shown that over a period of 4 to 10 years using 2 different sets of data, we find order seems to stay the same. The mean levels are relatively stable, maybe a little bit of increase in mastery, but no evidence whatsoever of convergence, possibly a little bit of evidence of divergence. And as I thank you, I just want to point out, I've been talking about basic values, not about dress, not about various customs, but about the basic orientations that societies emphasize to deal with critical problems of human regulation. And it's been over a short period. Maybe longer periods, we will see greater change. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Schwartz, for launching us in a very thorough and articulate manner. I now want to introduce our second speaker, Professor Tom Smith. Professor Smith is an expert in survey research, specializing in the study of societal change and survey methodology. He's the director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Society at the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. And for almost 30 years, he's been the co-principal investigator of the National Data Program for the Social Sciences and director of its General Social Survey, the GSS. And I suspect that for many people in the field, GSS and Tom Smith virtually go together. He's also at the international level the co-founder and former Secretary General of the International Social Survey Program, the ISSC, the largest cross-national collaboration in the social sciences. He's taught at a number of universities in the United States and abroad, and also the recipient of numerous honors, among them the Worcester Prize by the World Association for Public Opinion Research. And Professor Smith is going to focus today, in terms of his talk, on globalization and religious change. Please welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm engaged in a project with support from the Templeton Foundation looking at religious change across the globe. And this is certainly not the final word of that project. Matter of fact, this is the very first word coming from that project. So what you're seeing are just a set of preliminary results. So first of all, we're going to look at, broadly speaking, what is the nature of religious change, and then how does that fit in with the theme of convergence and divergence here? Well, what is our expectation in terms of religious change? There are two dominant theories which really point in opposite direction. The one, which is of course widely known, is secularization theory, which in its simplest form postulates that as countries modernize, they will take and become less religious. And if the whole world is modernizing, if globalization is a global phenomena of modernization, that would take and argue, therefore, that the direction is both towards the secular side and towards convergence then. Convergence in a secular state as countries modernize would be what that theory would predict. Now, in counter to that theory is basic religious socialization theory, which basically says that families pass on religions to their children and that religions are specifically designed as institutions to take and encourage and facilitate that socialization. In other words, what religious socialization theory says is that if anything should be stable across time and should be able to perpetuate itself, religions should be able to do that, because in terms of both family dynamics and institutional dynamics, they're designed just to do that, perpetuate themselves. Okay, so what is the situation of religion in the world? First of all, and I won't present any data to this because it's so obvious, but we need to establish it as the foundation is. Of course, there is a great deal of religious diversity across the world. Of course, obvious diversity in that the dominant religion in different societies varies greatly. But well beyond that obvious difference is the fact that even within religious traditions, there are huge levels of difference in the belief and behavior levels, for example, within Muslim countries, within Christian countries, and so on. Great deal of diversity. And great deal of diversity within the specific versions. For example, in the United States, there's a very strong evangelical Protestant segment, a segment which is really not well represented basically in any other Christian country. So a very unique example of a diversity of religion in America. Okay, so we're starting off with religion being very diverse in terms of the major religions, the levels of beliefs, the levels of behavior in religion here. What is the change? Table 1 here on your handout, and we'll be looking at basically none of these specific numbers here, but the table there, the first part of Table 1 summarizes cross-national trends. And first of all, I'm just going to take and present the basic finding of Table 1 and Table 2, and then I'll go back into a little bit of the nuance there. What is the basic result? If we look at cross-national trends in Table 1, 14 of the 17 trends are in the direction towards less religion. 14 of 17 direction of religion is declining. If we look at the second part of Table 1, the U.S. trends only, we see there are 19 trends there, and 17 of 19 trends are in the less religion direction. So as a broad generalization, pretty simple, overwhelmingly the direction of religious change is from the religious to the secular, according to this. Now look at Table 2. Table 2 tries to look at change not through trends, but by saying, well, let's assume, big assumption here, keep that in mind, let's assume for the time being that age differences represent cohort differences that reflect change over time. I'm not telling you for certainly that it does, but let's just assume for the time being that it does. What do we see here? We see if we look across age groups, there are 32 comparisons there. In all 32, the younger generation shows a more secular profile than the oldest generation. So there's not a single counterexample when we look at age. So if we look at first glance at trends and age differences, the conclusion is very simple. Secular direction here. But if we look at the trends more closely, we see that that simple and fairly strong observation has become much more nuanced and subtle. If we look at the trends, the cross-national trends, the changes, although predominantly in the direction of secular, are very small. The average percentage point change of the 14 trends moving in the secular direction is between 0.4 of a percentage point, and the biggest one is a 3.9 percentage point decline. Not per year, but across the entire time series for whatever number of years are covered. So these differences are overwhelming in one direction, but very modest in size in terms of average. Second of all, if we look at in one of the reasons why the average change is so small is that they are, while on average tending to take and go in the secular direction, they're very mixed within any particular series. So if we look at these particular 17 series, we see that the movement in the secular direction is true from as low as only 30% of the countries to as high as no more than 77% of the countries within each of the particular series. So it's in each of the series is quite mixed. There is a overall average direction which tends to be secular, but that is a function of very diverse differences within the individual countries within the time series. If we look at the U.S. trends are a little bit larger in the secular direction, but here we can take and compare the magnitude of those religious change trends to, in the General Social Survey, we have 1,000 different variables that we have trends on. And if we look at the magnitude of the religious trends, they are small compared to the average trend. So again, a clear direction, but not very impressive in terms of magnitude. And here, with the yardstick of being what is compared to other trends. So if we look at trends in all kinds of things like gender roles, in ethnic equality, in civil liberties and whatnot, on average, those trends are much larger in the United States than the religious trends. So again, a clear direction, but rather modest in size. Now, what about the age differences? The age differences are moderate to large. At first glance, they certainly look more impressive than the trends do, but they are very far from regular or systematic. There's a measure I have in that table which I call age low to high. And let me explain what that column is. That is the proportion of differences in which the youngest age group had the most secular position and the oldest age group had the most religious position. In other words, you have a nice ordered relationship there. Well, if you look at that, you see that even though on average there is this clear direction that on average the older generation is much more religious than the other, in a high proportion of countries, you don't get the perfect lineup. You get a much less clear, much less well-ordered pattern. If the differences are the result of a kind of relentless modernization leading to secularization, you would want to take and find a much more regularly ordered pattern in which each cohort is quite steadily moving from religious to a secular direction. On average, that is the difference, but the pattern is much more mixed there. Now, the second thing to keep in mind is that the age differences predict societal change only if they reflect cohort differences and not aging differences. And there are, of course, good reasons to expect that a large part of the differences across the age groups are actually aging differences. Why would we expect this? Well, two primary explanations for that. First of all, there's a life cycle explanation, which basically says that people age as they retire, as they become empty nesters. Religion takes up a bigger part of their life. So it's kind of so you would expect a growth of religion because of a reorientation of life priorities as one age. I think even the stronger prediction is the mortality prediction. As you get older, you get closer to the likely point of death, and your thought begins to think about, well, okay, I'm going to die in a few years, I'm getting old, what happens next? Young people can kind of ignore that issue, or at least put it deep in the back of their mind. The older you get, the argument is, the more to the front of the mind is, and the more likely perhaps you'll turn to religion as a phenomena, as a belief system that will give you an answer to what happens when I die. So those are reasons why you might expect an increase in religion with age. Now, I've just started the analysis to take and separate out the age and the cohort differences. To look at age differences, all I need is one survey at one point in time. But to get cohort differences, what I want ideally is at least 3 surveys with about 15 to 20 years in time. And there's much, much smaller range of sources. I have looked at a number of U.S. studies, though, on religious things so far. And what they basically take and tell me so far is that the age differences, the raw age differences, are partly cohort differences and partly aging differences. So, I mean, it's basically what you would expect. It's a mixture of both. But at least to put it this way, you certainly have to take in the U.S. data, at least suggests, and to the extent that it will extend, the pattern will extend to other countries, which only further research will demonstrate whether that's true. It does suggest that a large part of the age differences that we're observing in the tables that I handed out are aging differences and not cohort differences. So you have to heavily discount this. Just how much, like I say, only further research will think. Well, okay, what about convergence and divergence? The patterns, as I tried to indicate in terms of the basic trends, are very mixed. There's a nice English phrase which I like to use, higgly-piggly. Okay. The pattern is very higgly-piggly. Then it goes this way, that way. It's very complicated. There's not simple. And partly because of that pattern, there is no clear pattern in terms, I mean, I can find a dozen examples of convergence, a dozen examples of divergence, a lot in which nothing is happening. I mean, I can find every single pattern. There's no clear overall pattern. There's only one small example, and I think it's one that won't surprise us when I mention it. One clear example in which there is, as a subset, and let me emphasize as a subset of the overall data, an example of convergence, and that is within Europe. And the small degree of convergence that's occurring is basically that Eastern European former socialist countries are becoming a little more religious, although not as much more religious as we sometimes think they perhaps are becoming. And Western European countries have continued the secular direction that most of them have been in for quite a thing, bringing them a little more in line with one another. So that's the one example of convergence. When we look at countries within Eastern Europe, within Western Europe, across all the other regions, no clear pattern of convergence or divergence. So, to sum up, the overall pattern of religious change is in a secular direction, but is a very complex pattern, and it's a very modest pattern. That doesn't necessarily mean that one has to take in question secularization theory for the following reason. I think many people have expected too much from secularization theory. If you actually go back and look at its roots, it's talking about a very long-term process of modernization. And it's arguing as one changes from, from a period in say, the Middle Ages to industrialization to post-industrialization, that modernization is occurring, and that this will take in decreased religion. And people have looked at some fairly short-term 10 or 20-year patterns of religious change, and they've found a number of cases, particularly in Western Europe, of which there have been signs of secularization, and they say, yes, see, secularization theory explains this. Well, secularization theory at most would explain a very slow change over a very long period, because it takes a long time, I would argue, for countries to really modernize. And countries don't modernize in 10 or 20 years. They may go through some very disruptive changes, but they don't fundamentally modernize. I would say the modernization is something you really have to think of more as century to century kind of change. And so maybe this small change is all that you could expect, secularization theory. So while I think the kind of some of the more recent applications of secularization theory are undermined by this data, I don't think necessarily that a more grounded understanding of it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith. Our third speaker is Professor Juan Diaz-Nicolas from Spain. He has had a very distinguished career in his native country, where he did the bulk of his graduate work in political science, but as someone who manifests diversity in a number of ways, he also did graduate work in sociology at the University of Michigan in the United States, and is a professor emeritus of sociology at the Complutense University in Madrid, and a member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. He's been involved in a number of different activities, both at the national and international level, over his distinguished career, and is an example of someone who also bridges academia and public service in the broader community. During Spain's political transition to democracy, he held several public offices in the government of President Suarez. Like all of our contributors today, has a very broad publication record, both in his native language and in English. He is going to talk to us today about convergence and or divergence of values as a consequence of changes in the social environment. Please welcome Professor Diaz-Nicolas.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much, Pierre, for your kind words. I will, in a sense, overlap with Professor Schwartz's presentation, but with a different set of data and a different theoretical framework. There it goes. Over the years, I've been doing research now for approximately about 45 years. And I like to always combine, as Merton said, combine research and theory. So what I have tried to do is to combine three theoretical approaches, and you will see how they fit in a sense. And the first issue that really rose my interest is, why do we talk about values? I mean, are values that important? And for that, the answer came from the ecosystem or social ecosystem theory developed a few decades ago by Amos Hawley and Otis Duncan, both coming from the Chicago School, but with a modernized approach to the human ecology approach. And from this theory, I got very much the feeling that the values are certainly very important because human populations adapt to their environment, not mechanically as plants or animals do, but they always adapt through culture. And we can, only for heuristic purposes, differentiate between material culture, that is technology, and non-material culture, which would be social organization encompassing both institutions, political, economic, family, and so on, but also belief and value systems. And I think it is very important to keep in mind that values are instrumental. They are instrumental responses that try, not always successfully, to get a better adaptation of populations to their environment. So I always kept that in mind in my research on values, because one of the things I have found that is lacking in some of the interpretations for value change is precisely why they should change or why they shouldn't. And of course, we see that change has become dramatically rapid in the past decades or centuries. I mean, there has been a continuous kind of explosion of change, both in population, being a demographer at the beginning of my career for quite a few years. I know that the population explosion is still going on. It took only 16 centuries and a half to double the population since this year zero in our Christian era, but it doubled again in only about 200 years, then in 100 years, and since 1950 we are tripling in 50 years. So I mean, population explosion explains a little bit, and it does impinge on environment, which is one of the topics for many of the sessions in this conference. Technology, of course, has exponential change by nature, but why should we expect that social organizations should remain the same? Or why people are so worried about value change? Values, as I say, are instrumental. So from there, I happen to get involved with Ron Engelhardt on his World Values I mean, he's been studying value chain since he included the first questions at the beginning of the Eurobarometer in 1973. So we have quite a few years of data all over the world, first with the European values study, then with the world values surveys. And we cover now about 100 countries, and we have data since 1981. That was the first wave, and it was a European values study. But then we have waves for 1990, 1995, 1999, 2000, and the last wave was in 2005 for the world values, 2008 for the European values, and we are now preparing the 2010 wave. So we have quite an expanded time to compare both spatially, countries, and in time. Well, the main theory developed by Engelhardt, and I will not go very much into his detail, is that the value change changes in two dimensions. The first dimension would be changing from values, what he calls scarcity and survival values, which are linked to the experience of insecurity, both personal and economic. And that was the characteristic of human history for most of the populations. I mean, only the very few, the very short elites could have more personal security and more economic security. But the bulk of the populations all over the world, for the most part of their history, were very worried and very concerned about just survival, economic and personal. Only since the Second World War ended, most of the populations in the most developed countries have had the experience of having really secure personal security and economic security. The welfare state, especially in the most developed countries, has given that a real security. So that would be the change that has been coming, and therefore generation or cohort would be very important, because since values are more or less well established when we get to be adults, those experiencing better social environments when they are young will probably change their values earlier or more intensively than the older generations, and that would explain, but I will comment afterwards in some of Tommy Smith's findings. Therefore, age would be a crucial variable, but also the degree of development. I mean, as I said, the more developed countries have given that personal and economic security earlier than the less developed countries, and to a greater part of their populations. Now, the second axis of change is the Weberian change from traditional to secular, rational secular values. And Engelhardt's theory would claim that change has been taking this path. Now, one thing that they say sociology, even though as Pierre said, I consider myself both sociologist and political scientist, but I think that political scientists rely too much on having countries as the units of analysis, and I tend to rely more on the individual as the unit of analysis. But I mean, that is a methodological issue in which I will not elaborate right now. According to this theory of value change, countries would and individuals would go from this corner to the other corner. So here we would find, or we would expect to find, the more developed societies. But keep in mind one thing, that I'm talking about age and development, which means that you might consider that change has taken place more rapidly in the developed countries than in the less developed countries. So you would find that. But you could also find differences within societies. I must say I reacted very strongly against Huntington's clash of civilizations. I think I have published enough data, and not only me, but many other people, showing that within region differences are greater in most cases than between country differences. So, but I will go on further. If we look at the map of countries, which I don't particularly like because of this issue of having countries as if everybody in a country would be more or less being reflected by the data. But anyhow, I must admit that Engelhardt has a point, because you find here in the right extreme high corner all the Scandinavian countries. Sweden is always the country more developed in anything you count on. And you have then the other European, Catholic Europe especially. There is a difference, and I agree with Solomon Schwartz in that respect very much. I always separate Anglo-Saxon countries from Western European countries. I think they have many things in common and many values in common, but they also differ very much. And I will, if I have the time, I will show one map afterwards. Otherwise, I will leave it for the discussion period. But it is true that in general, they correlate. And I don't have it here, but all the evidence, when you compare countries in time, show that most of them go in the expected direction. And we have now 5 waves to compare that. But we can say that there are exceptions. So, for example, the former Soviet communist countries have gone backwards in the scarcity self-expression values axis. Some other countries have gone down in the traditional. But those are specifications, as Lassersfeld would tell us, that one has to explain case by case. Now, because of what I said, I happen to know a very important Norwegian back in the 60s, and that is Johan Galtung, one of the founders of the Peace Research Institute. He continues to be very active, and I meet him from time to time because he's a nomad, but he spends part of his months in Spain, in the Mediterranean, and he continues to be, as I say, very lively and very active. But he developed a theory which is very, very useful, and I have always used it, which is the center-periphery theory. And that fits very well with value chains developed by Galtung, in the sense that you would expect, of course, that central countries would be the first ones to acquire the new values. And that is true. And you would expect that within each country, those social positions more in the center, that is, those that are more rewarded in terms of income, education, power, prestige, and so on, which is the social center for Galtung, they would also be the first ones to acquire the new self-expression values rather than the old scarcity values. Well, all the evidence I have found, both, using many of these countries at different levels of development and so on, show that the theory, center-periphery theory, is correct in both senses. That is, when you use countries as social center countries, like the more developed, and the social periphery or the periphery countries as the less developed, that shows. But I said, okay, if both Engelhardt and Galtung are correct in their assumptions, we should be able to find that. So what I did was, using data from the world values, I was able to define center, middle, and periphery in different countries. Here you have only an example of several European countries, so you wouldn't find a great difference because Europe has many common values, or Western Europe. But you see that the 2 items that measure more materialistic values, scarcity values, which is maintaining order in the country and fight rising prices because they go for the personal security and the economic security, they are much more chosen in the periphery than in the center. However, the two more post-materialistic items, which is freedom of expression and giving people more say in political and important governmental matters, are much more important in the center than in the periphery. And that holds, I mean, for Spain, since I include the variables needed to build the social position index, which are all background variables, socio-demographic, and the items for Engelhardt's measure of post-materialism. In all my surveys, and I conduct a monthly survey since October '86, every single month, so I have time series for more than 230 months, I can tell you that this works perfectly all the time. I cannot show the evidence, but I have publications where you have it. So I said, well, if both theories are correct, we should find that elites in developed and non-developed countries should be sharing common values. But they would differ from the values in their non-elites, that is, their social peripheries in each country. And my hypothesis was that the difference between elites and non-elites in developed countries would be a little less important than in less developed countries. So one would expect that this would be the greatest difference in values. Well, I did a first analysis comparing Mediterranean countries, both North and South Mediterranean countries. I couldn't include Israel because most of the items, the variables that were necessary were not included in the Israel data set for the world values. So, I promise that I will continue, and I have Israel in many other patterns. Well, comparing this Southern Europe, that is North Mediterranean countries, with Southern Mediterranean countries, I found that really, as you would expect, elites in developed and less developed societies had very common values. And should that be a surprise? I don't think so. I mean, this conference is a good example. We come from all countries in the world. We share, we all use internet, we all read more or less the same literature, we use more or less the same methods for our research. I mean, we have lots of things in common. But are we examples of our societies? Not necessarily. I mean, we differ. And you would find that the more social periphery strata in different countries will have greater differences. But this has come because, and I would have to go back to the ecosystem model, because technology, especially the developments in communication and transportation, have made it much more possible interaction, interdependence. And that means that we are adopting, isomorphism is becoming more and more important. Airports are the same all over the world. Universities are becoming more and more the same. Many things, because of interchange, they are, isomorphism is becoming much more important than it was centuries ago. I will go a little faster. Because the second example for convergence and divergence, I took it from Spain, and I did, since I have so much data, I did a generational approach, not only in age group comparisons. I want to show that there are cases where sample surveys, no matter how well they are done, are influenced by some happenings, which are exceptional. Here, for example, in '95, there is a decline a decline on the values in the terms of the traditional axis. Well, it could be an error, and I would say it's an error if I was sure that it was an error in the sampling design or whatever. But what happened is that in 1994 and 95, we had that great crisis of confidence in our political institutions, because there were, for those that know Spanish history in the past years, we had great scandals where the governor of the National Bank was in prison because of bad practices. The director general of the big police, the Guardia Civil, which is really the big police corps in Spain, was on search by Interpol because he had taken the money. And there were lots of news on the papers about economic scandals. I mean, that was the end of, on the other hand, very good government of Felipe González, but that, I mean, that happens in the best families. And I mean, there was such a crisis of confidence that it's no wonder. But we happened to conduct the survey in 95. Had we done it in 96, probably things would have been different. But the trend from from wave to wave is quite consistent. But if you go for generations, I use the term of generation used by Ortega y Gasset, our great philosopher, of 15 chords for each generation. I do think that nowadays change is so rapid that 15 years is too much. For those of you who have children or grandchildren, I have 10 grandchildren myself, and I can see that 15 years is too much. Now, I mean, the difference on chords is becoming shorter and shorter all the time. I mean, but anyhow, you see that the oldest generation in Spain, and that combines people measuring them in different times, they had scarcity and very traditional values. They continue to have them today. As you go on, every generation has been going on the expected path of change. The very last here, I ask for your, I mean, I must admit I have an error. This generation is not the same as that one. This is the very young, and it would be 82 to 96. So keep that. But that is a very short generation, or it was a very short generation yet in 2000 when we conducted the last surveys before, I mean, when I did this graph. Now I have the 2005. Anyhow, I belong precisely to this generation, the middle one, and you can see that the change for these two generations is much greater than for the previous two, and then it is lower or smaller than the change that has taken from my generation to the next. But then it has shortened. So this is I mean, these two generations are the ones that did the political transition. I mean, I was able to witness the transition from inside, being a young adult, and the next generation did even go, I mean, it went even further in value changes. But so there is the expected change. There you have the combination of waves and generations. So this would be the old generation, and that would be the youngest generation. And you see that even though changes are not perfect, but they do show that there is a trend. So every generation is really adapting itself to the new values. So even the old generation is much more towards the self-expression values than they were, I mean, in 2000, as they were in 1981. So in only something like 19 years, they had gone over to the new self-expression values. And that is because of more economic security. I mean, development in Spain, economic development took place during the 60s. So they were really witnessing change. I will go on to show some of the data, for example, here where you have family orientation, and there is consistent differences between the older and the younger generation in each wave, younger generations being less family oriented than the older generations, but there is also some change a long time. They are not perfect. I mean, I know there is imperfection in all of our findings in research. We would like it to be much better, but that is. But the trend is, if you compare especially 81 with 2000, you see a lot of change. The same would be true for religious beliefs. You can see that there are great differences between age groups, but there is also change for the same for each generation through time in the expected way. And with religious belief, it is more complicated. I mean, it is not a linear trend. It has ups and downs. But the important thing, and this will I will finish in a minute, Per. I'm not. I don't know whether I'm over time. Okay, because this is the real test, which I like. Because if Engelhardt was correct, and the change of values is based on the fact that we have acquired more personal and more economic security, the crucial test would be that if there is less economic security and less personal security, there should be a reversal. We should expect a reversal. Has this happened? Has there been any evidence that we have experienced now more personal insecurity than a few decades ago and more economic insecurity than a few decades ago? I think we would agree that that has been true. September 11 in the US was something that hit the whole world because we are becoming a smaller world. I mean, it affected probably, but not only September 11, but what came later. And we are going from one threat to another threat. The last one, well, the two last ones have been almost overlapping. Financial and economic crisis world over. Banks going bankrupt. Most Western governments going into bank intervention, something that has not even been discussed in any parliament. I mean, one of the most important bases of free market economy and capitalism has been changed overnight without even a discussion in parliament, in any parliament. I mean, this has been a change almost as important as the collapse of the planned economy in the former Soviet countries. This is a great change, and it means economic insecurity, unemployment, especially for the young. I mean, that is economic insecurity, and therefore terrorism, the growth of crime rates and organized crime, it certainly must have an influence on people's values. And I go back again to the previous, my first slide. I mean, values are instrumental responses that populations give. Even our preoccupation with the environment is an instrumental response. Well, here you have data for some of the more developed countries from 81 to 2005, the 5 waves of values studies, and you have many of the countries, and you see that post-materialism, as measured by Engelhardt, has been growing in all of these countries till 2000, more or less. I mean, the patterns are not perfect, but there is a pattern. But there is a fall in most of these countries, especially France, Italy, Spain, even the US, there is a downtrend from 2000 to 2005, a period where there has been a return to more insecurity, both economic and personal. I must say that Engelhardt was not very happy when I showed this in a meeting some years ago, and then I convinced him that this was really the best proof that the theory probably was well-grounded. But most important, I compared the social center, I mean Galton's theory, with the periphery. And here you have the data for the center, but the center is now going down in their post-materialistic values more than the periphery. That is, according to Galton's theory, they are picking on the new values before the social periphery, because values will go from the center to the periphery. A further test is that authority was a declining value. Respect for authority had been more or less stable, but there is an uprise in all of these countries of greater respect for authority. And again, you have that is even more in the case of the social center than in the social periphery. So I think that values have changed. There has been this period of modernization, which much industrialization, then the post-modernization period, or post-industrialization, but then we are probably witnessing now the beginning of a new change in political, economic institutions because of globalization, but a change that is going to affect also both from ecosystem theory and from values change theory. I have the feeling that we are probably at the very end, which it doesn't mean that it will be tomorrow or next week, but that we are probably at the end of an era which was characterized by two models, economic and political, which are free market economy, which never was really free market, and parliamentary democracy. And I don't know what will be the new models. I wish I knew, but I think we are at the verge of probably changing. Certainly, I could show you how there is more convergence. I've done a lot of research comparing, especially the Mediterranean. That's one of my favorite subjects. And you can see that when you compare three groups of European countries, that is West European, East European Christian, and East European Orthodox, and three groups of Islamic, East European Islamic, Middle East, or Maghreb, and you find lots of differences. I must say that the variation you find within countries is much greater than within regions and that between regions. But I have to stop here, and we may find just one slide, which is the very last one, which is something I'm now working on, and we may discuss. That is combining two questions. It's national pride and will to fight for one's country. And my interest was very great when I compare Anglo-Saxon countries with West European countries, Catholic and Protestant, and Japan. This is maybe something for the discussion. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Diaz-Nicolas, and thanks to all of you. For sure, you've delivered on the promise that I laid out on your behalf at the beginning, that we were going to get some very, very high quality presentations this morning. A very, very rich combination of factors and both the theoretical grounding and the empirical basis. Let me begin the interactive part by a very short footnote. I'm going to address this particularly to the younger members of the audience. One, I really encourage you to position yourself to be a chair of a session as soon as possible in your careers, because you get to do things like I did last Sunday, which is convene our panelists to coffee and tea, and throw questions at them, and really get that kind of more social exchange that is one of the great benefits of these kinds of meetings. What I'm hoping for now is that you'll get to share some of what the pleasure I had in interacting with them sitting around a table in a restaurant, which is a little harder to do in a room like this. As promised, though, the first opportunity for comment goes to the three of you. So in no particular order, or no one has any obligation to say anything if you don't want to, but we have heard some suggestions that there might like to be some comments among you. I'm going to keep this to 5 minutes. We're within about 1 minute of where we should be at this point. So anybody just lead off. Go ahead.
I would like to comment on Professor Schwartz's finding of the great difference in Spain in only 4 years. Now, in 2004, we had the massive bombs on the trains, which has been the greatest terrorist attempt, and Thomas Smith was a great witness because we had a meeting the very same day, one of these international groups meeting in Madrid, and we were all a little shocked and concerned. And actually, I think that may explain, just as I did for the 1995 data on my own. I mean, when you have something really big, it's going to affect a survey that is conducted at that moment. And to Thomas Smith, I saw that I would
let me just comment on that. I would expect the same thing, and we happened to be in the field both in Oklahoma City when there was the bombing in Oklahoma City, and when our Prime Minister Rabin was murdered in Israel. And in both cases, we saw a spike, we saw a real change in values, which had totally disappeared within 1 year.
Yeah.
Which says something about the resistance of values to change.
Yeah.
Yes, they will shift, but it's like a rubber band which snapped back almost entirely to the same
as
place.
I showed in my graphic. I mean, in 2000, things were as they should. I think that this kind of happenings has a very great, intense effect, not on values, but on opinions. And what we get in survey is expressed attitudes, but not necessarily the values. May I ask, Tom? I think that probably the little change you show in your religious is because demographic replacement is very low. So there is a persistence of courts, and that is, I mean, there is not a great change in the population, but only one court lifts the population pyramid or rectangle every year. So you couldn't find a great change. So I would agree that that is a very consistent finding. But the other thing I would like to ask you is, don't you think that the secularization hypothesis has been based mostly in practice and not necessarily on beliefs? And I think from my own research that the great change has come not in beliefs but in practice. I mean, there is much less practice, but that would also be true in the political sphere, where people are less, I mean, have less membership in political parties, or they go to voting less, but they participate in politics through new ways, not the traditional ways. So it's behavior that changes, not necessarily the values, but that's a question.
Right, yeah, let me comment on that. There's a one interpretation called believing but not belonging, which has been used to describe the pattern in many Western European countries, which alludes to what you just commented on, that it is perhaps, to the extent that secularization is occurring, there is evidence that it is greater in the weakening of the strength of organized religious institutions and how they most immediately interact with people, which is through the behavior, such as attending religious services, contributions to religion, financial contributions to religions, and so on. Matter of fact, it is particularly notable that both in the United States and from the World Values Study, that two of the trends which are in the religious direction, counter to the overall trends, are belief in afterlife, which is, of course, a core fundamental belief of many religions, and yet they actually show an increase over time. Now, however, in contrast to that, just to underline the score that this is not all simple and clear, perhaps another core belief in a deity, does show decline, both in the United States and across countries. So here we have two of the most central religious beliefs, fundamental beliefs of religions, afterlife and God, and they go in opposite directions there. So it is a complex pattern.
Now it's your turn. Good, got some hands going up. Heavy, let's go right with you.
I've learned quite a bit from all the presenters. I was wondering in the maps that two authors offered on cultural regions. In Professor Schwartz, Latin America appears in the middle of it. And in Professor Diaz, Latin America is at the bottom. You introduce the traditional cultural values. I would like you both to comment on how you look at this peripheral region of the world in terms of basic values.
I'd point out one other difference, and that was where the ex-communist countries were. They were at the top left in the Engelhardt maps, and in my maps they were doesn't matter exactly, but they were in a very different position. What's happening here has to do with a major difference between the Engelhardt dimension of secular traditional versus secular rational, and my dimensions, two of my dimensions of egalitarianism, hierarchy, and of autonomy embeddedness. If you look very closely at the items that measure secular rational versus tradition, you find that of the five items, I think 4 really have to do with religion. And what's going on is that any country that is high in population is high in religion, it comes out tradition, and therefore at the bottom in the map. And any country that is low in religiosity, which at the time was true of the ex-communist countries, and to some extent is still true in the larger world picture, comes out at the very top. And in fact, if you were to take religion out, there's only one Engelhardt dimension. It would just go up the diagonal. But in my system, religion plays a minor role. And as a result, Latin America is not at an extreme. Latin America has essentially a balance, sort of halfway on all 3 dimensions. And the ex-communist countries are largely, you find that they are low in mastery. Keep your head down. It doesn't pay to shake the boat. Don't expect very much. And somewhat embedded. We need the primary group to protect us against the larger environment.
Professor Diaz?
Yeah, very quickly. First of all, I think it was clear from my presentation that I don't think that theories are belief systems. They are scientific instruments. And I always use theories to see how much they help me to understand and to try to explain reality. Therefore, you wouldn't be surprised to see that I am one of those that has tried to see what is the commonalities and the differences between Solomon Schwartz's approach and Ran Inglehurst. None of them is my own, so and there is a lot of coherence. But in that same sense, I must admit, and many of my colleagues in using world values data would tell you that it is true that the secular traditional axis does not work as good. I mean, actually, most of my work I use the scarcity self-expression axis because that has proven to work very, very well. But the other axis, I am not happy. I have, but that I am not the only one. And I think that's where you find the greatest difference with Solomon Schwartz. One of my colleagues in Spain, who died, a lady professor who died only a couple of years, was Solomon Schwartz's person in Spain, Maria. And she had done also a comparative study of both approaches, and there is a lot of common. So I don't think there is such a great difference. I have included your scale and Engelhardt's scale in the same data set, and you find lots of things which are relevant in common. But going to your Latin American, it is true that Latin America in general has progressed more, if we can use the word progress, has gone more to the new self-expression values, but not so much in the traditional axis as measured by Engelhardt. Maybe measured by other means might be a better way to measure the traditional secular. But probably, I mean, I think that from many of their data, certainly Latin American countries in general, and there are great differences between Bolivia and Chile or Argentina or Mexico. I mean, there are many differences within region differences, but in total, I would say that it is true that, especially in terms of family and religion, which are the two more fundamental bases for differences among countries, also with the Islamic countries, not in family, but in religion. In all other things, I think there is convergence, and since that was the main title of our group, I should reinforce that. There is a lot of convergence, but there is still some differences that have not really gone down.
All right, let me move back to the audience. I know that we could keep this going, I'm sure, a whole half hour, just on one question, but I'm going to go to this gentleman here, please.
Good morning, and thank you for all the presentations. Yes, I'm Winnie Dagley from the Philippines, University of the Philippines. Yes, first of all, what I got from the three presentations is that the cultural or social values are related to the capacities of the countries, for instance, to achieve a certain kind of development or a certain level of development. And since day one of the forum, we agreed that the world is, we're facing enormous changes. The dominant development paradigm is facing quite a collapse, or it's in the state of turmoil right now. And we're facing challenges of climate change, and we agreed that it's anthropogenic in nature. And we said that the inequality of income in the world is quite increasing. And so given all these changes and given the commonalities in your findings, I would like to pose this question, quite a broad question. Do you think we're going towards the right direction? Yeah. Yes, that's basically my question for all of you. So is this direction that we're heading to, do you think it is good for all of us? Yeah, there. Because right now, okay, this is the context of my question. I have this feeling that, I don't know, maybe more and more countries might feel that we're more trapped. We're more trapped by some significant moments in the history, and by the dominance of certain types of development paradigms. So, and given that you're saying that we're heading towards more rationalized societies, definitely, more secularized, and maybe to a certain extent, homogenization of some cultural values. So, do you think we're heading to that direction, and who's going to set that direction? Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, you've been given the challenge. Thank you for the question and the context.
Okay. It's not the kind of question you really like to answer if you play the science game most of the time, because it's you're asking a value judgment, of course. And in developing my own theories, I've tried very hard to avoid taking a position which says that one type of adaptation to the environment is better or worse than another. Rather, I've tried to develop a theory which says there are alternative ways to solve the problem. Countries can solve them in very different ways. Cultures can solve them in very different ways, and it's not my position to judge. However, obviously, I'm also a person and not just a scientist. And as we listen to Juan, clearly I think you were taking a very clear position that it's better to move toward self-expression and away from survival emphases, and perhaps better, I didn't hear that coming clearly, perhaps better to move towards secularization, perhaps not. And I might be accused of taking a position personally that it is better to live in a society that emphasizes egalitarianism rather than hierarchy, that emphasizes autonomy rather than embeddedness, and that emphasizes harmony rather than mastery, maybe. But there are costs to each of these emphases as well, and being at one extreme or the other is probably bad, as a matter of fact. Narroll, I think either Norwegian or Swedish anthropologist, sociologist, many years ago, was the first to do rankings of nations and ranked Norway as the best place in the world to live. And he ranked it that way after taking into consideration, for example, that autonomy was very high here and it cost in terms of neuroticism and in terms of suicides. But when you weighed everything together, that was a choice that you could make. I'll finish with just one comment. When I'm being foolhardy, I have the sense that the world is moving in a particular direction very, very slowly. And that is that there is parallel movement, not convergence. I'm not at all convinced that there is convergence going on. But in terms of my way of looking at cultures, I see movement away from embeddedness hierarchy toward autonomy egalitarianism. I don't see clear movement on the mastery harmony dimension. That has to do with the high correlations of the first two dimensions with socioeconomic levels, which have in general been going up. But it's parallel, so the whole world is moving around, the picture stays the same.
Yeah, I'm going to go to each panelist on this one because I think it was addressed to all three. So I'm going to go to Tom Smith next.
Well, my basic response is I have no idea what direction the world is going in, and whatever direction it's going in, I have no control over it. So, but let me flesh that out a little bit. I mean, I think of, early in the 20th century, you have the rise of communism. Then all of a sudden, at the end of the 20th century, communism collapses and disappears. I mean, there were very few theorists and not even very many American patriots who were predicting that. And then, so with the collapse of communism, world peace and the threat of nuclear war was all supposed to take and go away. And then we have, 9/11, and the huge increase in anxiety about destruction from that. We have, with the collapse of communism, a great flowering of kind of a laissez-faire form of capitalism. And then now, in the last year, we see the great, dangers of unregulated capitalism. And with those two examples alone, and I could point many other examples are, who's going to predict the future?
I share Tom Smith's comments, but I always like that sentence that Alvin Toffler in his third wave took from a Chinese or a proverb, which says that predicting is very difficult, especially if it concerns the future. But apart from that, I must say that I'm optimistic by nature. I mean, personally, I'm optimistic, but from the ecosystem model many years ago in the 70s, when Meadows published his Limits to Growth book and all that, I was very shocked and very dubious about how, because I noticed that there had been development, and especially in Spain during the 60s, and in all over the world, and you had all the studies of Hudson Institute showing that there would be economic growth for everybody, and more or less we were all heading towards paradise. So Meadows' book was kind of a shock. But it was not only Meadows' book. The Global Report 2000 to President Carter, a thick book, Interfutures done by OECD, and many other reports from the UN in the 70s were already saying where we were heading. And I was very curious because the scheme, I will simplify it very much for you because otherwise it would be another lecture. And it was that population growth would have a great pressure over the environment, over resources, and that would lead to less quality of life. And less quality of life would mean that those in power, those in positions of power, could try to defend their lifestyles, and those who would suffer would be middle classes and the lower classes, and that then differences would increase rather than decrease, as had been the case during the 60s. And that was also more or less in the predictive theories of Karl Marx and Lenin, that differences would increase, inequalities. And then if inequalities increase, then you would have more conflict, either latent or manifest. And if there was more conflict, then there would be more resorts from those in positions of power to authority. So from the ecosystem model, pessimism was the future. I mean, more authoritarian regimes. It doesn't matter whether right authoritarian or left authoritarian, they are both the same. But I more or less said, well, that is to be put away because that's not the case. I mean, post-materialism is increasing, self-expression, we have that. I was very shocked when I started to see the results of the 2005 data, because they tend to show the same picture coming from another thing, which is growing insecurity, personal and economic, but that seems to come together with the fact that inequalities within country inequalities and between country inequalities are increasing and not decreasing since the 70s. And I think that all white books, green books, yellow books, whatever, they all show the same picture. Inequalities are increasing and not decreasing. So, and then the question about financial capitalism versus industrial capitalism, I think is making or has made a great difference. So what's the future? I don't know. I tend to think that there will be self-defeating prophecies. That is, that the prospect of such bad future. But let me end with a more trivial sentence.
when you read science fiction, and I am particularly fond of science fiction too, science fiction works that focus on technology picture for us a bright future. But when they focus not on the material culture, but on the non-material culture, that is organization, it is more narcotics, more crime, more wars, and so on. So when they focus on technology, the future is bright. When the focus is on social organization, the future is not so bright. So I prefer the technological science fiction. Thank you.
All right, we have time for one more question or comment, and then I'm going to reserve to myself 2 minutes to try and do a wrap-up. Sir.
Thank you. All your presentation was based on observing verbal behavior, what people say. Yeah. What's missing in this point for me is what people do. It seems that it is as important as what they say, and it is very often different. One very relevant indicator what people do is whether they do have children or they do not have children. The Western world, let's say in English, yeah, is not reproducing itself. For 20, 30 years, the average birth rate in Europe is for 20 years below 1.4. That means that for 100 potential mothers is in the next generation 70 potential mothers, and in the third generation it is half. Yeah? In 2 generations you are on the half of the numbers. It goes on for 20 or 25 years, and there is no substantial changes. Yeah. So it seems to me when you observe these differences, and there are differences between the Western world. Well, in Israel, there's a tragical difference between the birth rate in the Gaza Strip and in the Israeli population. It is one of the core of the tragedy of the conflict, because it's difficult to solve indeed on this ground. So when we follow this point of view, perhaps we would get different results than the general picture which I hear from your presentation, that the world is moving towards the modern developed world. All right, it is, but this world doesn't has a zero reproduction strategies too.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to acknowledge your intervention as a comment, as an alternative perspective, and time precludes giving the panelists the opportunity to respond to it, but I appreciate the fact that you put an alternate perspective forward to what we've heard. I again want to thank everyone for being here, most particularly those of you who have listened attentively throughout, and those of you who asked questions, and our panelists who really brought an enormous amount. As you can imagine, trying to achieve any kind of synthesis, given this diversity, is a daunting task. And so perhaps this should also be taken, like our immediate previous speaker, not so much as a synthesis as it is a comment, an informed comment from an additional perspective. I'm a psychologist, you know that, but I'm also trained as an historian. And so you're getting a historically minded psychological response. And it goes in part, I think the second question that we got, I think really was a very challenging question that needed a whole day seminar or workshop more than a couple of minutes to probably respond to. But in the spirit of what we've heard, and on the issue that we were put to in terms of how the symposium was organized, convergence or divergence, It's not a simple answer, and it's not a single answer. There are elements of both convergence and divergence, and I think the fundamental question is, what do we get? What does social science, from the various disciplines that are represented here and others, tell us that helps us understand the factors that work toward convergence and those that work toward divergence? And so we've heard about phenomena, recent phenomena and historic phenomena, but they're not all lived the same way. How 9/11 was experienced in the global north is fundamentally not the same as though it was experienced in the global south, although we could say there's a common sense of increased threat, an increased sense of threat. But how that threat is experienced and what it compels by way of behavior is not entirely the same. And understanding that, I think, is fundamental to ensuring the planet's survival. From a psychological perspective, what is important to me as I listen to this are the factors that promote and enhance resilience and the capacity to adapt in ways that maintain some semblance of social order. Because as a historian, we are not the first civilization to experience the potential for massive change. Whether we're going to get massive change in the next little while, as some have suggested, remains to be seen. But if it does come about, we're not the first ones. Major civilizations in all the large regions of the world have come and gone. But some have survived. Some have survived over long periods of time. And the ability to survive is in part related to social and psychological structures that have complex economic and political dimensions as well that favor us to adapt, or the failure to adapt often results in collapse and disintegration. And so one of the things that I think that we look to from the data is not just the factors that converge, but the outliers. We've heard several times how Spain is an interesting case study, if you want to take a national framework as a way of looking at things. And one of the things that stands out about Spain, and anecdotally, what I can say among Spanish colleagues and friends that I know, whether they started off historically as center-right and remain center-right or center-left, is one of the things that they all share in common is an enormous sense of pride in the ability of their country to have managed this transition peacefully, to the largest degree peacefully. And it's a source of common pride, regardless of difference in socioeconomic status, regardless of difference in political ideology, and regardless of difference in psychological types, if I can put it that way. So I think that these are important elements that, as social scientists, we can bring so that when the question that our friend asked a few minutes ago is presented to us by policymakers, by decision makers, we don't just fall back and say, oh, well, we don't have any answers, figure it out for yourself. What we do is we help them learn how to read the data. They will then filter it through their own ideology and make whatever decisions they choose to make. But we do have the potential to influence how they think across the ideological spectrum, and I think that's one of the other challenges that really falls to us in a forum like this and what we take home from it. Thank you all again for being here. Very much appreciate it.